Hello everyone, I'm Bruce Murray, and yes, I am a Belleville. It grieves me that I'm not there today, but I am dealing with some health issues, which they have a good prognosis, so I'm happy to be here with you on camera. This is a special place where you are, because my mother and I used to come every summer to Memramcook, Belleville Village, and Près d'Enhaut, and search of Piau. We visited every grave and every graveyard in the community, both at St. Thomas and the church at Près d'Enhaut, and we never found Piau to this day. And that's over a period of 40 years. Not only that, but we never knew anyone who knew where his grave was. I am still pursuing that, but it's great to be here, and I'm happy that you are in the orchard that Piau planted 200 years ago. It's a very special place, and to have had it grow to the Belleville apple orchards that are famous everywhere is quite amazing. I still have some seeds from Melanson Village. There's an apple orchard there that the Acadians planted in Melanson Village just outside of Annapolis Royal. I went there last summer, and the trees are all still there. They're about 50 feet high, which is quite high for an apple tree, but they were planted 250 years ago. So I'd like to take you back to that time. It was 1606 when Piau was born, and he was born in Port Royal. The English, of course, were always raiding the French at Port Royal, and the Acadian community was always fighting and fighting and fighting. And the sad story is that Piau's father, who fought to save his land, was murdered in front of his family. Piau was only one, but was murdered in front of his family, and it was pretty gruesome. And they were forced to go and live with their grandmother, Marie Dugas Melanson, who was the founder of Melanson Village, with her husband, Charles Melanson. And it was a pretty difficult life, but they made the best of it. And Piau visited Grand Pré every winter to visit his uncle Pierre Lavadeur, who was the brother of his grandfather, and the founder of Grand Pré. Piau was very, very intelligent. He spoke both French and English fluently throughout his life. Many of the Acadians were not so pleased with the fact that he did speak English, but of course his grandfather was English, so he learned English and it helped him. So I'm going to read the first reading from the book, Piau, Journey to the Promised Land. Some of you may have the book. If you don't, it's available at the reunion. These sections I've chosen are written in the first person because I kind of used Piau's voice and channeled him rather than speak about him in the third person. So it begins as, I am Pierre Belleville, but my people call me Piau. I am in my 100th year. My spirit has embraced this land and its ancestry for nearly a century. Every possible joy and calamity has come upon me because I am Acadian. Like Moses and the Israelites, we escaped the mighty Pharaoh and his army. My people and I escaped the British and their army and have wandered through the wilderness, searching for the Promised Land. The North Star guided me into exile, and on my return I crossed the River Jordan into the land of Canaan. I am my own master here, and those I love are with me. Therefore I am one with God, who has protected me, and one with my ancestors who bore great hardships in order that I should survive, procreate, and live in this land. I was a witness to the resurrection of my people, and I surrender my spirit happily in the knowledge that my descendants will forever remain in the land of their forefathers. And of course, most of you know the story. It began at Port Royal. But at the time of the expulsion, Piau decided to take all of his family, who were not living at Melanson Village. They were living at a place called Godet Village, which was up the Annapolis River. And they escaped through the North Mountain to the Bay of Fundy, where they had secretly put 12 chalupes or vessels in the woods in case it was necessary to make an escape. And the native peoples, of course, were running through the woods telling them of the horrors that occurred at Grand Pre. And of course, the minute they all heard this, they packed up their things and they headed for the Bay of Fundy. And they stayed in St. Croix for about a month. And then they decided it would be better to go further up on the Bay of Fundy where it was more protected, to a place they called French Cross. And they built a French Cross there. And there were about 350 families that were lodged there for about 3 months. And after the 3 months, they decided that this may not be such a safe place because the British ships were going by on a regular basis. And winter was coming, and it was pretty brutal on the Bay of Fundy, as we all know. So he decided to talk to all the elders, and the elders decided that half of them would stay, and 200 of them would go. So Piau and his group, about 250 strong, went to St. Mary's Bay, went through the Petit Passage across the bay to a place that was then an island and is now called Ile de Piau. It is on Belleville Cove, on the Clare shore. And we went there last summer to visit the Église Saint Bernard, which is the church, a cathedral that was built to honor Piau and that group of people the first winter they were in exile. It was a thrill to read parts of the book to Bellevaux in the church, which is a gorgeous church. And we then went to the graveyard, which is along Piau's path. We saw a lot of the graves of the people that died the first winter, one being Piau's brother Jean. And it was quite amazing. They have a little chapel there that you can pray. It's part of the greater area at Belleville Cove. And it was quite moving for me and the people that I was traveling with. So we really got the sense of that first winter. And Piau, of course, spent that winter starting out very enthusiastic, very optimistic, but of course winter set in. They ran out of musket fuel. They did have guns, but many were pretty much in a starvation state by the time the spring happened. In fact, sometimes the only thing they caught in a day were mayflowers, but they did survive, most of them, and they headed over to the Petitcodiac, and it was really wonderful. They were well fed, and they sailed up the Petitcodiac to Coverdale, but found a refugee camp filled with people that were starving. And the famous tale that is told is Piau and his nephew Pierre went down the Petitcodiac in a chaloupe looking for a boat, a British ship, that they could seize and get all the goods from. And they did. So I'm going to read that passage, which is pretty famous. Most of you probably already know. It's right here. By the time the LeBlanc brothers had joined me, they were interested in what I was about to suggest. Look at these giants sitting here amongst us. God must have gifted us with the Herculean strength and size for a purpose. I knew I had attention of the entire group. Look outside the group and you become aware that most of them are refugees in the camp and they do not have the energy to carry out any plan of survival. But with these handsome Titans and a brilliant plan, anything is possible. What I suggest is we board a fishing vessel and sail down the Petitcodiac to Fort Beauséjour. It is now in the hands of the British. By the time the LeBlanc brothers had joined us, they were interested in what I was about to suggest. Look at these giants sitting here amongst us. God must have gifted them with Herculean strength and size for a purpose. I knew I had the attention of the entire group. Look outside the group and you become aware that most of the refugees in this camp do not have the energy to carry out any plan of survival. But with these handsome Titans and a brilliant plan, anything is possible. What I suggest is we board a fishing vessel and sail down the Petitcodiac to Port Beauséjour. It is now in the hands of the British. We have several muskets, but we are out of ammunition and gunpowder. These are essential for us to continue hunting. We have these starving Acadians to feed. On the day of our departure, we added Cyprien Gutreau to our group, for he was a massive man and required at least one other to achieve our objective. It was a fortuitous decision. Indeed, so successful were we that the tale of the exploits has been repeated over and over again through the years and has made its participants famous to this day. Our story is eclipsed only by the heroism of my brother Charles capturing the HMS Pembroke. There were 2 pistols in Abraham Dugas' trunk. Ammunition and gunpowder were provided by Grand Pierre from the remnants of the arsenal pilfered from the Pembroke. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. Our firearms were reinforced by ammunition stolen from one British ship to assist us in the takeover of another English vessel. Our fishing vessel sailed with the tide down the mighty Petitcodiac. Its passengers were fortified by the belief that we would win the day. We entered Beaubassin early in the morning, and I conjured in my mind Jesus navigating his fishing boat in the stormy Sea of Galilee with his disciples. In our case, we were mastering a different storm. It was not long before we noticed a schooner anchored out in the bay. As we approached the vessel, my nephew Pierre exclaimed, "That is Father's schooner. I would recognize it anywhere. We have arrived here for a purpose. God is guiding us this day." The boat did appear to have Charles' imprint upon it. There was no question I had sailed in this very schooner many times. Now was our chance to recapture it and benefit from its booty. We dropped our sails 100 yards from the schooner, and it was not long before its captain and its 8 crew members appeared at the railing. I was the first to speak, being the only one of the group fluent in English. Good day, Captain. We request permission to come aboard." The captain appeared to be shocked by our sudden arrival, but he smiled broadly, not attempting to disguise his look of good fortune at having its fugitive Acadians in his spider's web. "Come aboard, gentlemen," the captain continued in his congenial manner as we climbed onto the deck of the schooner. Once all 6 of us were standing on board the vessel, the captain declared, "I am now informing you that you are prisoners of war. It is our duty to search for and apprehend Acadian fugitives. I declare you are prisoners." It was at that point I looked at Charlotte the Great and said, "Charge, Charlotte!" With a massive blow, Charlotte was the first officer of the desk. He was dead on impact. With blows equal to the first, he downed 2 more crewmen. Bonaventure and Joseph were equally deadly in their attacks. The largest of the crew, who was an extremely powerful man, attacked Pierre and attempted to throw him overboard. Seeing his compatriot in trouble, Charlotte gave a horrifying roar, knocking the man down with the force of 3 men. Cyprien and I drew our pistols and pointed them at the captain and his remaining crew members. They recognized immediately that they had lost the day. The captain capitulated easily and got down on his knees, begging us to spare him. I had only one thought at that moment, and that was the memory of my heroic father succumbing to the British when I was a year old. I could not remember his brutal murder, but I never forgot the loss. I beg of you, monsieur, see me adrift in a lifeboat, and I promise you I will not pursue you. Really? Captain, I will deliver you the same justice as the English granted my father back in 1707. Ask God to forgive you for your sins. The terrified captain rose and crept backward toward the railing of the schooner. A feeling of overwhelming anger overcame me as I aimed directly at the heart of my enemy and pulled the trigger. The Englishman fell backward over the side of the boat, splashing into the freezing bay. I stood nevertheless, motionless, mindful that justice had been done and that retribution for my father's death had been finally achieved. Cyprian finished off the other crew members with his pistol, and Charlie de Benaventure threw their bodies overboard. Had any of the British crew been permitted to live that day, we would have been in serious trouble. We had eliminated the prospect of future regret. So, throughout his life, he did regret that he had to kill someone, point blank. But of course, he had to do that to save his people. And he went back up the Petitcodiac with arms and food and fed the refugees at Coverdale. So, during the summer, they decided that it would be prudent, since the British would be on the lookout again, that they would travel across country to the coast near Shediac, and they went to the beaches along the Northumberland Strait, and on their arrival they saw, looking up the beaches for miles, thousands and thousands of Acadians who had escaped the British and were not exiled. They did not end up on the ships. So together they journeyed to the Miramichi and spent the next 4 years quite happily away from the British. And they got assistance from, of course, Governor Vaudreuil in Quebec, because France was at war with England. And now the Acadians considered themselves French, and the British were the enemies, which they were. At the end of the war, once Quebec fell, they knew that their fate was sealed. So they voluntarily retraced their tracks down the beaches to Beausejour to take the unthinkable oath of allegiance to George III. They didn't stay there long. They were taken on ships to the Avon River and down the river past Grand Pre to Fort Edward, and they became prisoners of war for the next 3 years. It was not an unhappy life because they were with their families. Occasionally, the men were taken off to Halifax to build the Citadel. That was where Piau met Colonel DeBar, who played a very important part in his life. The most horrifying part of the last summer that they spent in Fort Edward was suddenly the British governor, Shirley, in Boston decided, you've got to get all the men out of Nova Scotia. And they put them on ships on George's Island. They had to leave their wife and children behind, which is unimaginable. And they set sail for Boston Harbor. They arrived in July, and they were below deck for probably about 6 weeks of hot, sweltering weather. And still, they were never taken to the docks. They just sat there. And Piau described it as horrific. And that's when he met Beausoleil, who was another freedom fighter of the Acadians. Both Beausoleil and Piau are the most famous of those freedom fighters. Piau was into quiet resistance. Beausoleil was a military resistance fighter. But they found a common ground, and in the book you will, I imagined a conversation that Piau had with Beausoleil. And then suddenly, after 6 weeks, the anchors were lifted and the captain said, "We're leaving." And it turned out that the people of Boston refused to take the Acadians. They'd already had enough. And so they shipped them all back to Halifax, which was a blessing for them. And they were reunited with their families at Fort Edward. And that's where Colonel DeBar comes in. He was the architect of the citadel in Halifax. And he was very attached to Piau because Piau was a mason and he helped build the ramparts at Citadel. So one day, Colonel DeBar arrived after the war had ended and they were free, made a proposition to Piau and his group to stick around and build a castle for him. And they built Castle Frederick, which took about almost 5 years to build. But they were very well taken care of. They were tenant farmers, and Colonel DeBar was very close to Piau. And so that took them to about 1768. And then Piau realized it was time to move on. And so he took his people with the good graces of Colonel DeBar. Colonel DeBar offered a tenancy to all the Acadians who wanted it to go to his lands in Memramcook. And Piau thought that was a great opportunity. And so he did, and he went on a ship to Fort Beausejour. And I'm going to read a passage about their trip across the Tintamarre Marshes to the Promised Land. So when they arrived in Beausejour, they began their journey across the Tintamarre Marshes, and this is the account. We Acadians were energized by the prospect of reaching the Memramcook River by sundown. With each step we took on our day's journey, we felt the cool breeze of freedom penetrating our bodies and filling our spirits with sublime expectation. This was a day I'd longed for my entire life. No British authority watching my every move, an independence that was never afforded us because we were Acadian, and a homeland that only we were responsible for. As we walked north over the marshes, where dikes still embroidered the landscape, we purged our souls, driving out the suffering and hardships we had been forced to endure for most of our lives. Native people met us along the way and welcomed us to the land of their fathers, the Micmac and the Malecite. We shared our food with them and requested they accompany us on our journey. They guided us across miles and miles of marshes and dikelands, only departing from us when we reached the east shore of the Memramcook River. There my people stood fixed on the spot, visualizing what their lives would be like once they had crossed the river. I could imagine how joyful Moses must have been when he first caught sight of the River Jordan. God, however, was affording me something that Moses did not experience. I would cross the Jordan to the Promised Land with my people and would be permitted to settle there until the end of my days. On the eve of our deliverance, we built huge bonfires that lit the sky with flames and sparks that seemed to reach the stars. We sang the ancient songs and we played music for our dancing. Even the elders joined in. Looking around, I saw a sea of young faces filled with hope. It was their time to begin a new life, nurture their children, and create a bright future for their descendants. Tomorrow would be the dawning of a new day. Une belle époque. When the sun rose on the following day, we gathered to pray by the river. I recounted the story of the children of Israel in entering the land of Canaan by crossing the river Jordan. They cheered when I declared that, unlike Moses, I was being allowed by the Lord to enter the promised land with my family and friends. The Acadians gathered on the eastern side of the Memramcook River began to chant my name, Piau, Piau, Piau. I began to weep tears of happiness that I would be so honored by the people I loved. Jen took my arm and squeezed it out of pride. The children danced around me and shouted the same, Piau, Piau. So the story and between Colonel DeBar and Piau was not complete. And not long after Piau had settled there in Memramcook, he got a letter from Colonel DeBar, who was his landlord, and it was delivered by one of DeBar's agents. And I want to read you that letter. My dear Piau, I have missed your company these past years since we departed Castle Frederick. We will be happy to learn that the estate has expanded to such an extent there is now 93 persons administering the advancement and maintenance of the manor house and grounds. Mistress Mary has borne me several children since you left, and they are thriving. I have finally completed my mapping expeditions and have drafted a book of comprehensive maps of the eastern colonies of Canada. You would be astonished at their accuracy. I must return to England to present my book, Atlantis Neptune, to the Admiralty and the Board of Trade at Westminster. And I have heard that the young King, George III himself, is interested in having a copy printed for his library. This is a very great honor. Now to the reason for this missive. Your contributions to the building of Castle Frederick cannot be quantified, for no calculation could measure its value to me. On a more personal note, your son, Joseph Piau, did me a great service assisting in the education of my mistress. For these favors I wish to return one in kind. On my lands on the eastern side of the Petitcodiac River, near its mouth, and in the shadow of the Beaumont Hills, there is a large acreage that I wish to grant to you and your son and his heirs. You will find a legal document enclosed that will certify the ownership. It is the least I can do to repay you for your friendship, unwavering loyalty, and exceptional service to my person and my interest. May you and your family enjoy great prosperity in the coming years. Yours most sincerely, Frederick DeBar, Colonel in His Majesty's Navy. And so it was, without divulging the contents of Colonel DeBar's letter to anyone but Jen, I asked Joseph Piau to accompany me on a walk over the Beaumont Hills to view the great Petitcodiac at high tide. He agreed willingly, although he gave me a curious and mischievous look. Perhaps he thought I was going to discuss his upcoming marriage to Marie-Joseph Godet, a descendant of Jen's Uncle Denis. And so we stood at the top of the hill and viewed the river and its mighty tidal bore rushing to its destination at Coverdale. He smiled as I described my courtship of Jen and our marriage. He seemed charmed. And after much discussion, I mentioned him to follow me to the bottom of the hill on the place that DeBar described in his letter. As we reached the land that was to be his, I recounted to Joseph Piau what the great DeBar had bequeathed him. He was overwhelmed with emotion. Is this possible, Papa? It is, my son. Remember, from every good deed comes another good deed. In your case, you paid dearly for your generosity, but God has delivered you a gift, and Colonel DeBar has heard his wish. As the tide rose higher and higher, we could see the sunbeams dancing on top of the water. It was at that magical moment that I drew a sack from my belt. and presented it to my son. Open the sack and, sorry, I'm getting choked up, sorry. I always get choked up at this part. Open the sack and pour the contents into your hand. Jose Piau gave me a broad smile and did as I asked. What are these, Papa? What do you think they are? They are apple seeds, Papa. The sack is filled with them. What does this mean? Many years ago, when you were only 4 years old, I collected these seeds from the apples growing in the orchard in Melanson village. My ancestors planted those trees when they arrived in Acadia. I felt that if I harvested them and kept these seeds, I would possess a little piece of Charles Melanson, Marie Dugas, my father Jean, my mother Madeleine, and all those who had gone before them. By planting these seeds here on your new land, you honor your ancestors and me. Tears appeared in our eyes and we embraced. I love you, Papa, and I love you, my son. And you were in the place that this all occurred. And the epilogue is, on the 100th birthday of Piau, although they said he lived to be 110, I think that might be an Acadian exaggeration. It was in 1806. Piau is celebrating his 100th birthday with all of his children and grandchildren at Belleville Village in the orchards where you are at this moment. Here I am in my son's apple orchard overlooking the mighty Petitcodiac River, comfortable beneath the blossoms in the birch that surrounded my descendants, who had gathered to celebrate my 100 years of life. My son is now the patriarch of Belleville Village, and I am my people's living ancestor. Soon I will join the ancient Acadians, the pantheon of those who, by the grace of God, created Acadia at great cost to themselves, so we could live here in peace. The new generation does not remember the deportation, but the elders will never allow them to forget the sacrifices of those who have gone before. I longingly look out at the Bay of Fundy, imagining a return to Melanson village, wondering whether someone has resurrected my homeland from the ashes of time. It is now time to close my eyes and sleep. Perhaps I will have visitors.